The morning sun was just starting to peek through the tall buildings of downtown when Harold Peterson stepped off the city bus. He moved slowly, like many men his age did. His gray hair was neatly combed but looked like he had cut it himself. The old brown suit he wore had seen better days. It was clean but wrinkled, and the sleeves were a bit too long for his thin arms. Harold carried an old leather briefcase that looked like it had traveled many miles. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, and one of the corners was held, together with black tape. He walked with small, careful steps toward the big courthouse building that stood like a mountain of stone and glass in front of him. The courthouse was busy that Tuesday morning. People in expensive suits hurried up and down the wide steps. Some carried fancy briefcases and talked loudly on their phones. Others walked in groups, whispering about their cases. Harold felt very small among all these important-looking people. When he reached the heavy glass doors. Harold had to use both hands to pull one open. A young man in a nice suit rushed past him without even looking. Harold did not seem to mind. He was used to being invisible. Inside the courthouse, the ceiling was so high that Harold had to tilt his head back to see the top. The floors were shiny marble that made clicking sounds when people walked on them. Everything echoed in the big space. Harold stood for a moment, looking around like a tourist seeing the ocean for the first time. The security line was long. Harold waited patiently behind a woman lawyer who kept checking her watch and sighing. When it was his turn, the security guard looked at him with tired eyes. "Empty your pockets, sir," the guard said in a bored voice. Harold carefully placed his old wallet, some coins, and a small notebook on the plastic tray. The metal detector beeped when he walked through, and the guard had to check him with a handheld scanner. It was just the metal buckle on his old belt. "You can go ahead, Pops," the guard said, not unkindly but not really caring either. Harold gathered his things and looked around the busy lobby. People seemed to know exactly where they were going. He did not. He walked slowly to the information desk where a tired-looking woman sat behind thick glass. "Excuse me," Harold said in his quiet voice. "I need to find courtroom 4B, please." The woman barely looked up from her computer screen. "Fourth floor, turn right when you get off the elevator, then left at the end of the hall." "Thank you," Harold said, but the woman was already helping the next person. Harold found the elevators and waited. When the doors opened, several people rushed out, almost knocking him over. He stepped inside with a group of lawyers who were talking about their case. "This should be easy," one of them was saying. "The old guy doesn't even have a lawyer. We'll be done before lunch." Harold listened but said nothing. He pressed the button for the fourth floor and stood quietly in the corner. On the fourth floor, Harold followed the directions he had been given. The hallways were long and filled with people, sitting on benches outside different courtrooms. Some looked worried, others looked angry. A few were crying. Harold found courtroom 4B and stopped outside the big wooden doors. Through the small windows, he could see people moving around inside. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The courtroom was bigger than Harold had expected. There were rows of wooden benches like church pews. At the front was a high desk where the judge would sit. The American flag stood in one corner and the state flag in the other. Harold walked quietly to one of the benches in the back and sat down. His old briefcase made a small thud when he set it on the floor beside him. A few people glanced at him, but most paid no attention to the elderly man in the worn suit. Near the front of the courtroom, a group of people in expensive clothes were talking quietly. The women wore perfect makeup and jewelry that caught the light. The men had suits that looked like they cost more than most people made in a month. These were the lawyers from Morrison Construction Company. Lisa Bennett was the lead lawyer for Morrison Construction. She was young, maybe 35, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her red suit was perfectly fitted, and her high heels clicked when she walked. She was looking through a thick folder of papers and talking to her team. "This case is a joke," she whispered to the man sitting next to her. "Some old man thinks we owe him money because our construction project made his garden dirty. We'll have this thrown out in 10 minutes. The man nodded and smiled. "Judge Kane doesn't like to waste time with nonsense cases. This Peterson guy picked the wrong judge to try to fool." Meanwhile, on the other side of the courtroom, Judge Richard Kane was in his office behind the courtroom. He was reading through the day's cases with his clerk, Susan Martinez. "What's this Peterson case about?" Judge Kane asked, holding up a thin file. Susan looked at her notes. "It's a civil complaint against Morrison Construction. An elderly man claims they damaged his property during the downtown development project. He's representing himself." Judge Kane rolled his eyes. "Another one of these nuisance cases. These people think they can get rich by suing big companies. They watch too much television. He's asking for compensation for property damage and emotional distress," Susan said. "Emotional distress," Judge Kane repeated with a laugh. "Let me guess, he's traumatized because some construction workers made noise during the day. I've seen 100 cases like this." Judge Kane was known around the courthouse for being tough on people who he thought were wasting the court's time. He had been a judge for 15 years and prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. He did not like people who came to court without lawyers, thinking they could handle complex legal matters on their own. Back in the courtroom, Harold sat quietly and watched the activity around him. He opened his old briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were handwritten notes on yellow legal paper. His writing was neat but shaky, the way old people write when their hands are not as steady as they used to be. Harold reviewed his notes one more time. He had spent weeks preparing for this day. Every evening after dinner, he had sat at his small kitchen table reading law books he had borrowed from the library and writing down important points. His neighbors would have been surprised to see him working so hard. To them, he was just a quiet old man who kept to himself and tended his small garden. The courtroom was filling up now. More lawyers arrived, talking loudly and laughing with each other. Court reporters set up their machines. A bailiff walked around, making sure everything was ready for the judge's arrival. Harold checked the old watch on his wrist. It was almost 9 o'clock. Soon Judge Kane would come out and Harold's case would be called. He closed his folder and put it back in his briefcase. Then he folded his hands in his lap and waited, like he had learned to do so many times before in his long life. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff stood up and called out in a loud voice, "All rise! The Honorable Judge Richard Kane presiding." Everyone in the courtroom stood up as Judge Kane walked in through a door behind his high desk. He was a tall man in his 50s with dark hair that was turning gray at the sides. His black robes made him look important and serious. He sat down in his big leather chair and looked out at the courtroom like a king looking at his subjects. "Be seated," Judge Kane said, and everyone sat down with a sound like wind rushing through trees. The bailiff called the first few cases. They were quick and simple, a traffic ticket here, a small dispute there. Judge Kane handled them fast, like he was in a hurry to get to something more important. Then the bailiff called out, "Peterson versus Morrison Construction Company." Harold stood up slowly from his seat in the back. His old knees made a small, cracking sound. He picked up his worn briefcase and walked toward the front of the courtroom. His steps were small and careful on the shiny floor. Lisa Bennett and her team of lawyers were already at their table. They had expensive laptops, stacks of papers, and leather folders spread out like they were setting up for a big business meeting. Lisa wore her confident smile and checked her phone one more time before putting it away. Harold reached the plaintiff's table and set his briefcase down. The sound it made was different from the quiet thud of expensive leather bags. It sounded old and tired. Harold pulled out his chair, which squeaked when he sat down. Judge Kane looked down at Harold from his high desk. His eyes showed that he was already not impressed. "Mr. Peterson, I see you are representing yourself today. Are you sure you don't want to get a lawyer for this case?" Harold stood up carefully and spoke in his quiet voice. "No, Your Honor, I believe I can handle this myself." Someone in the back of the courtroom made a small laughing sound. Judge Kane heard it and almost smiled himself. "Very well, Mr. Peterson. Please tell the court what your complaint is against Morrison Construction." Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out his manila folder. Some of the papers inside were old and had been folded and unfolded many times. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Your Honor, Morrison Construction was building their new office tower next to my small property. During the construction, their work damaged my garden and my fence. The noise and dust made it impossible for me to enjoy my home. I tried to talk to them about it, but they ignored me." Judge Kane leaned back in his chair and looked bored. Mr. Peterson, construction projects make noise and dust. That's just how it works. You can't expect a major development to stop because you don't like a little dirt on your tomatoes. The people in the courtroom laughed. Harold's face turned, a little red, but he kept talking. Your Honor, I believe there are laws about how construction companies must protect neighboring properties. I have done some research. Research? Judge Kane interrupted. Mr. Peterson, do you have a law degree? No, Your Honor, but have you ever taken a class in property law? No, Your Honor, but I have been reading. Judge Kane held up his hand to stop Harold from talking. Mr. Peterson, this is a courtroom, not a library. You can't just read a few books and think you understand complex legal matters. More people in the courtroom laughed. Lisa Bennett was trying not to smile too, widely, but Harold could see she was enjoying this. One of her assistant lawyers was actually checking his email on his phone, not even pretending to pay attention. Harold tried again. Your Honor, if I may continue with my case. By all means, Judge Kane said with a wave of his hand. Please, dazzle us with your legal expertise. Harold opened his folder and pulled out a piece of paper. As he did, several other papers fell to the floor. The courtroom erupted in laughter as Harold slowly bent down to pick them up. His old back made it hard for him to reach the papers, and he had to use the table to help himself stand back up. Take your time, Mr. Peterson, Judge Kane said in a voice that made it clear he thought this was all very funny. We have all day. Harold's hands were shaking a little now, but he found the paper he was looking for. Your Honor, I believe Morrison Construction violated City Ordinance Number 247, which requires construction companies to protect neighboring properties from excessive dust and debris. Judge Kane sighed loudly. Mr. Peterson, are you seriously telling this court that you expect us to shut down a $50 million development project because your petunias got dusty? The laughter in the courtroom was louder now. Even the court reporter was smiling. Harold felt his face getting warm with embarrassment. Lisa Bennett stood up. Your Honor, if I may address the court? Please do, Ms. Bennett. Maybe we can get some sense into this discussion. Lisa smiled and spoke in a clear, confident voice. Your Honor, Morrison Construction followed all proper procedures during the downtown development project. Mr. Peterson's property is a small residential lot in the middle of a commercial district. The minor inconveniences he experienced are simply part of living in a growing city. Thank you, Ms. Bennett. At least someone in this courtroom understands how the real world works. Harold tried to speak again. Your Honor, I also believe they violated environmental protection rules. Environmental protection? Judge Kane laughed out loud. Mr. Peterson, are you now an environmental lawyer too? What's next? Are you going to tell us you're also a doctor and an engineer? The courtroom was full of laughter now. Harold felt very small and alone at his table. He looked down at his papers, trying to find the right words to explain what he meant. Your Honor, Harold said quietly, I spent many hours researching the laws that apply to this case. I believe Morrison Construction broke several rules, and I deserve compensation for the damage they caused. Judge Kane shook his head. Mr. Peterson, let me explain something to you. This is not a game. This is a serious courtroom where real legal matters are decided by people who actually understand the law. You can't just walk in here with some papers you printed from the internet and expect to win a case against a major corporation. Lisa Bennett was now openly smiling. She whispered something to one of her assistants, who chuckled and nodded. They were not even trying to hide the fact that they thought this whole thing was a joke. Harold looked around the courtroom. Everyone was looking at him like he was a foolish old man who didn't know what he was doing. Some people were still smiling from the earlier laughter. Others looked like they felt sorry for him. But Harold was not ready to give up. He had come too far to quit now. He reached into his briefcase one more time and pulled out another folder. This one looked different from the others. It was newer and had a small lock on it. Your Honor, Harold said, his voice a little stronger now. I have one more piece of evidence I would like to present to the court. Judge Kane was getting tired of this whole situation. He looked at his watch and saw that Harold's case had already taken up 20 minutes of his morning. That was 20 minutes too long for what he thought was a waste of time. Mr. Peterson, Judge Kane said with a heavy sigh. I think we have heard enough. This court cannot allow every person who gets a little dust on their property to sue major construction companies. If we did that, no building would ever get built in this city. Harold stood holding his new folder. Your Honor, please. I have one more document that I think is very important for this case. Judge Kane rolled his eyes so far back that people in the front row could see it. Mr. Peterson, you have already shown us your internet research and your handwritten notes. What could you possibly have that would change anything? Lisa Bennett was gathering her papers, getting ready to leave. She had already started thinking about her next appointment. One of her assistant lawyers was texting someone, probably telling them how quickly they had won their case. Your Honor, Harold said, his voice getting a little stronger. I believe this document will help explain why I understand the law better than you might think. Judge Kane made a sound like a person who was very tired. Fine, Mr. Peterson, show us your document, but make it quick. This court has real cases to handle today. Harold walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. Each step seemed to take forever. The courtroom was completely quiet now. Even the people who had been whispering stopped talking. Harold reached Judge Kane's high desk and held up the folder. Your Honor, I would like to present this evidence to the court. Judge Kane took the folder with an annoyed look on his face. He expected to see more handwritten notes or maybe some papers Harold had copied from library books. But when he opened the folder, his expression changed completely. The first thing Judge Kane saw was an official seal. It was gold and blue and looked very important. Under the seal were words printed in fancy letters. Judge Kane's eyes got wide as he read the words. The courtroom was so quiet that people could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. Judge Kane read the document again, like he could not believe what he was seeing. His face went from annoyed to surprised to shocked. Harold stood quietly in front of the judge's desk, waiting. For the first time all morning, he did not look nervous or embarrassed. He stood a little straighter and his voice was calmer when he spoke. Your Honor, I thought it might be helpful for the court to know about my background before we continue with this case. Judge Kane looked up from the document and stared at Harold. Then he looked back down at the paper. Then he looked at Harold again. His mouth was open, but no words came out. Lisa Bennett noticed that something had changed. The judge was not making jokes anymore. He was not rolling his eyes or sighing. He was just staring at Harold like he had seen a ghost. Your Honor, Lisa said, standing up. Is everything all right? Judge Kane did not answer her. He was still, reading the document. He turned to the second page, then the third. Each page seemed to make him more shocked than the last. The people in the courtroom started to whisper. They could tell that something important was happening, but they did not know what. The bailiff moved closer to the judge's desk, trying to see what was in the folder. Harold waited patiently. He had waited for this moment for a long time. He knew that once Judge Kane read those papers, everything would change. Finally, Judge Kane looked up. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking a little as he held the documents. He cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was very different from before. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Kane said to the courtroom, I need to inform everyone about something very important. The courtroom became completely silent. Even the people in the hallway outside seemed to stop making noise. Judge Kane held up the document so everyone could see the official seal. The plaintiff in this case, Mr. Harold Peterson, has just presented his judicial credentials to this court. People in the courtroom looked confused. They did not understand what judicial credentials meant. Judge Kane continued, his voice getting stronger but still shaky. Mr. Peterson is not just an ordinary citizen. According to these documents, Harold Peterson served as Chief Justice of our state Supreme Court for over 20 years. The silence in the courtroom was broken by gasps and whispers. People turned to look at Harold, who was still standing quietly in front of the judge's desk. Lisa Bennett dropped the papers she was holding. They scattered on the floor around her feet, but she did not notice. Her confident smile was completely gone. Her mouth was open and she looked like someone had just told her the world was ending. One of her assistant lawyers looked up from his phone for the first time all morning. Did he just say Supreme Court? The man whispered. Judge Kane was still reading the documents. These papers show that Chief Justice Peterson retired from the Supreme Court 5 years ago, after a distinguished career. He wrote the majority opinion in more than 300 cases, including several landmark decisions about property rights and environmental law. Harold reached into his briefcase and pulled out another folder. Your Honor, if it would help, I also have letters of recommendation from my former colleagues and copies of some of the cases I worked on that relate to construction law. The change in Harold was remarkable. He was still the same elderly man in the worn suit, but now he spoke with quiet authority. His voice was calm and sure, like someone who had spent decades making important decisions. Judge Kane looked at the letters Harold handed him. They were from other judges, lawyers, and government officials. All of them praised Harold's knowledge of the law and his fair treatment of everyone who came before his court. Chief Justice Peterson, Judge Kane said, using Harold's proper title for the first time, I must apologize for the way this court has treated you today. I had no idea who you were. Harold smiled a small, kind smile. Your Honor, there was no way you could have known. I dressed like an ordinary citizen because I wanted to see how the court system treats ordinary people. I wanted to experience what it feels like to be on the other side of the judge's bench. Lisa Bennett finally found her voice. Your Honor, Morrison Construction had no idea that Mr. Peterson that he is Chief Justice Peterson, Harold said gently. But you can call me Harold. I am retired now. The courtroom was buzzing with excited whispers. People were taking pictures with their phones. Some of the lawyers in the audience looked embarrassed, remembering how they had laughed at Harold earlier. Harold turned to face the courtroom. I hope everyone here will remember that every person who comes to court deserves to be treated with respect, no matter how they look or how they dress. Justice should be the same for everyone. Judge Kane nodded and looked down at Harold's original complaint with new eyes. Chief Justice Peterson, would you like to continue presenting your case? Harold nodded to Judge Kane and walked back to his table. But this time his steps were different. He no longer shuffled like a confused old man. He walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms just like this. 1. Lisa Bennett was still standing at her table, staring at Harold like she could not believe what had just happened. Her perfect hair was starting to come loose from its tight bun, and her hands were shaking as she tried to organize her papers. Ms. Bennett, Judge Kane said, please be seated. Chief Justice Peterson will now present his case. Lisa sat down, hard in her chair. She whispered frantically to her assistant lawyers, why didn't anyone tell me who he was? How could we not know? One of the assistants was already typing on his phone, probably searching for information about Harold Peterson. Boss, he whispered back. I'm looking him up now. This guy wrote some of the most important property law decisions in state history. Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out several more folders. These were not the worn manila folders he had shown before. These were professional legal folders organized with colored tabs and clear labels. Your Honor, Harold said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had commanded courtrooms for decades. I would like to present the facts of this case in a more organized manner. Judge Kane leaned forward, paying close attention. Now, please proceed, Chief Justice Peterson. Harold opened his first folder and pulled out a set of photographs. Your Honor, these pictures show my property before, during, and after Morrison Construction's project. As you can see, the damage was not just a little dust on some flowers. He handed the photos to the bailiff, who brought them to Judge Kane. The pictures showed a beautiful small garden with carefully planted flowers, vegetables, and trees. Then they showed the same area covered in thick dust, with broken fence posts and dead plants. The final pictures showed the property after the construction was finished, looking like a wasteland. Your Honor, Harold continued, my property was not just a simple garden. It was a carefully maintained habitat that I created. Over 15 years of retirement, I grew rare native plants that provided food and shelter for local wildlife. Judge Kane studied the photographs carefully. They told a story that Harold's earlier simple words had not captured. This was not just an old man complaining about dirty tomatoes. This was serious environmental damage. Harold opened his second folder. Your Honor, I would like to present the relevant case law that applies to this situation. Lisa Bennett felt her stomach drop. She knew that if Harold really was a former Chief Justice, he would know the law better than anyone in the room. Harold pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. Your Honor, I would like to cite the case of Martinez versus City Development Corporation, which I had the honor of writing the majority opinion for in 2018. Judge Kane's eyes widened. The Martinez case was famous among lawyers. It had established important rules about how construction companies must protect neighboring properties. In that case, Harold continued, the court ruled that construction companies have a legal duty to minimize damage to adjacent properties, especially when those properties contain established ecosystems or rare plants. Harold was no longer the fumbling old man who had dropped his papers earlier. He spoke with the precision of someone who had spent his career interpreting complex laws. Furthermore, Harold said, pulling out another document, the case of Environmental Protection Society versus Riverside Construction, which I also presided over, established that property owners have the right to compensation when construction projects destroy established wildlife habitats. Lisa Bennett was frantically flipping through her own files, trying to find something to argue against Harold's points. But she was fighting against the man who had written many of the laws she was supposed to know. Harold opened his third folder. Your Honor, I would also like to present evidence that Morrison Construction violated several city ordinances during their project. He pulled out official documents with city seals. City Ordinance 247 requires construction companies to install protective barriers when working near residential properties. Morrison Construction did not install these barriers. Judge Kane nodded as he read the ordinance. Go on, Chief Justice Peterson. City Ordinance 156 requires construction companies to water down work areas daily to prevent excessive dust. Morrison Construction did not follow this rule for over 3 weeks. Harold continued presenting evidence, each piece more damaging to Morrison Construction's case. He showed permits that were not properly filed, environmental protection rules that were ignored, and safety measures that were skipped. Your Honor, Harold said, I also have testimony from my neighbors who witnessed the violations. He pulled out signed statements from several people who lived near his property. They all described the same thing. Weeks of excessive noise, dust, and damage that went far beyond normal construction inconvenience. Lisa Bennett finally stood up. Your Honor, I object to this evidence. Mr. Chief Justice Peterson did not present any of this during his opening statement. Harold smiled gently. Ms. Bennett, I believe you will find that the rules of evidence allow for the presentation of new evidence when the opposing counsel has not had adequate opportunity to review the case thoroughly. Judge Kane looked at Lisa Bennett. Ms. Bennett, did Morrison Construction prepare adequately for this case? Lisa's face turned red. The truth was that Morrison Construction had barely prepared at all. They had assumed it would be a simple case, against an old man who did not know what he was doing. Your Honor, Lisa said weakly. We prepared based on the information we had. Harold pulled out one more folder. Your Honor, I would like to present my final piece of evidence. This is a report from the State Environmental Protection Agency about the damage to my property. Judge Kane took the report and began reading. His expression grew more serious with each page. The report detailed extensive environmental damage that would take years to repair. According to this report, Harold said, Morrison Construction's actions destroyed a registered wildlife habitat that was home to 3 species of rare birds and several endangered plants. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the people in the back were leaning forward to hear every word. Your Honor, Harold continued, the Environmental Protection Agency estimates that it will cost $40,000 to restore my property to its original condition. That does not include compensation for the emotional distress of watching 15 years of careful work destroyed in a matter of weeks. Lisa Bennett looked like she wanted to disappear. Her confident team of lawyers were all staring at their phones, probably looking up Harold's legal decisions and realizing how much trouble they were in. Harold closed his folders and looked directly at Judge Kane. Your Honor, Morrison Construction did not just make a little dust. They destroyed a carefully maintained ecosystem, violated multiple city ordinances, and ignored state environmental protection laws. They did this because they assumed that a quiet old man would not fight back. Harold's voice carried the weight of decades of legal authority. I am asking this court for full compensation for the damage to my property, payment for restoration costs, and damages for the emotional distress caused by watching my life's work destroyed. Judge Kane looked at Lisa Bennett. Ms. Bennett, how does Morrison Construction respond to these charges? Lisa Bennett stood up slowly. She looked at her notes, then at her assistant lawyers, then back at Harold. For the first time in her career, she had no idea what to say. Lisa Bennett stood at her table looking at Harold with a mixture of fear and respect. She had never been in a situation like this before. All her expensive legal training felt useless against someone who had helped write the very laws she was supposed to know. Your Honor, Lisa said, her voice much quieter than before. Morrison Construction, we were not aware of the full extent of the damage to Mr. Peterson's property. Judge Kane raised an eyebrow. Ms. Bennett, are you telling this court that your client did not investigate the property they were affecting with their construction? Lisa looked down at her papers, then back up at the judge. Your Honor, Morrison Construction followed all the procedures they believed were necessary at the time. Harold stood up calmly. Your Honor, if I may respond to Ms. Bennett's statement? Please do, Chief Justice Peterson. Harold walked to the center of the courtroom, where he could address both the judge and Lisa Bennett. Ms. Bennett, the procedures that Morrison Construction should have followed are clearly outlined in the city building codes. These codes have been the same for over 10 years. Harold pulled out one more document from his briefcase. Your Honor, this is a copy of the building permit application that Morrison Construction filed with the city. On page 3, they specifically acknowledge that they understood their responsibility to protect neighboring properties. Judge Kane took the document and read it carefully. Ms. Bennett, it appears that your client signed a document promising to follow the exact rules that Chief Justice Peterson says they violated. Lisa Bennett felt her last hope slipping away. Your Honor, construction projects are complex. Sometimes unexpected situations arise. Harold smiled kindly at Lisa. Ms. Bennett, I understand that construction can be complicated, but the law is clear about what happens when companies choose to ignore their responsibilities. They must pay for the damage they cause. Judge Kane nodded. Chief Justice Peterson, based on the evidence you have presented, how much compensation are you seeking? Harold opened his final folder. Your Honor, the Environmental Protection Agency report shows that restoration will cost $40,000. I'm also seeking $20,000 for the emotional distress of watching my life's work destroyed, and $10,000 in punitive damages to ensure that Morrison Construction learns from this experience. $70,000 total, Judge Kane said. Yes, Your Honor. Lisa Bennett felt dizzy. $70,000 was more than Morrison Construction had expected to spend on this entire project's legal fees for the whole year. Judge Kane looked at Lisa Bennett. Ms. Bennett, does Morrison Construction wish to present any evidence in their defense? Lisa looked at her assistant lawyers, but they just shook their heads. They had nothing that could compete with Harold's expertise and documentation. Your Honor, Lisa said weakly, we would like to request a brief recess to consult with our client. Request denied, Judge Kane said firmly. Morrison Construction has had plenty of time to prepare for this case. Chief Justice Peterson came to court prepared with proper evidence and legal arguments. Your client chose to treat this as a joke. Judge Kane stood up, and everyone in the courtroom stood with him. After reviewing all the evidence presented today, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Harold Peterson. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. People pulled out their phones to text friends and family about what they had just witnessed. Morrison Construction is ordered to pay Chief Justice Peterson the full amount of $70,000 within 30 days, Judge Kane continued. Furthermore, Morrison Construction must hire an environmental restoration company to return Mr. Peterson's Property to its original condition. Lisa Bennett sat down heavily in her chair. Her perfect morning had turned into the worst case of her career. Judge Kane was not finished. Morrison Construction is also ordered to implement new procedures to ensure that this type of environmental damage never happens again. They must hire an environmental consultant to review all future projects that might affect neighboring properties. Harold stood quietly at his table, showing no emotion. He had expected to win once he revealed who he was, but he took no joy in Lisa Bennett's embarrassment. Judge Kane looked directly at Harold. "Chief Justice Peterson, I owe you a personal apology for the way this court treated you today. Your decision to come here as an ordinary citizen has taught everyone in this room an important lesson about respect and dignity." Harold nodded graciously. "Thank you, Your Honor, I accept your apology." Judge Kane turned to address the entire courtroom. "Let this case be a reminder to everyone here that justice should be the same for all people, regardless of how they look, how they dress, or how much money they have. Every person who comes to this court deserves to be treated with respect." Harold packed his folders back into his old briefcase. The same briefcase that had looked so shabby when he first walked into the courtroom now seemed like a treasure chest of legal wisdom. As Harold prepared to leave, Lisa Bennett approached him. "Chief Justice Peterson," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for how we treated you today. It was unprofessional and wrong." Harold looked at her with kind eyes. "Ms. Bennett, you are a good lawyer who made a mistake. The important thing is that you learn from this experience. Next time, remember that every case deserves your full attention and respect." Lisa nodded, her eyes showing that she truly understood the lesson Harold was teaching her. Harold walked slowly toward the courtroom doors. As he passed the rows of benches, people stood up to show their respect. Some of them were lawyers who now realized they had witnessed legal history being made. At the door, Harold turned back to look at the courtroom one more time. Judge Kane was still at his bench watching Harold with newfound admiration. "Your Honor," Harold called out, "I hope that in the future, this courtroom will remember that wisdom and knowledge can come in many different packages. Sometimes the person who looks the least important might have the most to teach us." Judge Kane nodded. "Chief Justice Peterson, this court will never forget the lesson you taught us today." Harold smiled and pushed open the heavy courtroom doors. Outside in the hallway, several reporters were already waiting. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse about what had happened in courtroom 4B. But Harold did not stop to talk to the reporters. He walked quietly to the elevators, rode down to the first floor, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. As Harold walked toward the bus stop, he thought about his small garden at home. Soon, thanks to the court's decision, it would be beautiful again. But more importantly, he had reminded everyone in that courtroom that every person deserves justice, no matter who they are. Harold Peterson, former Chief Justice of the state, Supreme Court, boarded the city bus and rode home satisfied that he had done something important. He had shown that the law works best when it treats everyone with dignity and respect. The next morning, newspapers across the state would tell the story of the humble old man who taught a courtroom about justice. But Harold would just tend to his garden and remember that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places.